So welcome. I'm Jennifer Slack, the Director of the Institute for Policy, Ethics, and Culture. I want to welcome you all to IPEC's discussion of international climate policymaking as part of IPEC's theme this term on designing the Anthropocene. So this is our first policy brown bag, but it's not exactly a brown bag because we provided the food. But so I hope you enjoy that. And thank you to Social Science for providing this space and allowing us to have the event here. We'll have more of these discussions, and we're hoping that other departments will also open to hosting events such as this. So we announce events like this in Tech Today, but I'm completely aware that lots of people don't read Tech Today. So what we've decided to do is start a listserv, and Aaron Scythe over here, who is the new Institute manager, is going to pass around a sheet of paper. If you'd like us to email you about our events, we'll do that. So please fill that out if you like. So if you read Tech Today, these events will be in there, but if not, we'll contact you, or even do both. It's a good way of reminding people what we're up to. So IPEC is an interdisciplinary institute. So our mission is to promote research, teaching, and policy engagement across the university, the community, the state, with aspirations to reach out much larger beyond the state of Michigan even. Sarah Green, as many of you know, embodies this interdisciplinary ideal. You see her in many places, with many different hats. She is an environmental chemist with a PhD in oceanography and an activist on energy and climate. She's been teaching a course, an interdisciplinary graduate seminar on climate science and policy for several years now. But you can find her all over. I first met Sarah when she was studying the movement of stam sands on Lake Superior. I run into her at meetings of the local energy company, the Ontonagon REA, causing a stir there. She's a founding member of the IPEC Executive Committee, and she's been leading IPEC's efforts this term on our Designing the Anthropocene programs. We've asked Sarah here today to open up discussion on international climate policy, because for a number of years, Sarah has engaged with international climate, environmental, and climate policy. When I asked her about, is it international climate policy, is it international environmental policy, she said environmental policy is climate policy. She has many stories to tell, but most recently, and the story we've asked her to tell today, is about leading the Michigan Tech delegation to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So I've talked with Sarah a lot about this, and I have had a very difficult time wrapping my head around exactly what goes on there, what her role is, and I know lots of other people have asked that question too. So today she's going to describe the policy landscape, to tell us what Michigan Tech can do now that we have UN observer status. Did I say that right? To consider how this can benefit our students, and to think about what other possibilities this might open up for us. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Jen. So I have been sort of struggling since actually before we went to the climate meetings in November to kind of explain what it's about and how to explain it, because it's kind of a big, complicated thing. So this is my first attempt. Please jump in with questions, and I hope we can have some discussion. I'll point out that there are 4, I think, people in the room who were there, wave, and we all went different directions. They all had different experiences, which was really great, so they can jump in with their own or give their own policy talks at some point in the future. So I opened up because I was trying to brainstorm about what to say, and I just all of these acronyms just like, well, should I talk about UNEA or IPCC or SDGs or COP or so so this just reminds me that stepping into another area. So about 5 years ago, I stepped into policy world from science. It's a whole other culture. You have to learn entirely new languages and whole structures of things and complicated. And so that's just a reminder that I don't need to know all those things. First here, I will thank the students who came along. We had 7 students from Tech plus an alum who came to COP. And also lots and lots of people who funded this really at the last minute. So Institute of Policy, Ethics, and Culture. Okay, one more time. And then if somebody knows how to work this and make the PDF thing come up. I got it to show up on the screen, but I can't move it or make it into a slideshow. It's just a PDF thing, but I can't move that. So Institute of Policy, Ethics, and Culture supported travel. Great Lakes Research Center supported us. EPSI supported students. Department supported students. Graduate Student Government supported students. Tech Forward an issue about sustainability and resilience. I basically went around with a hat. And Gillian Bowser at Colorado State was a key coordinator of this whole thing. We coordinated with several universities. And through her, we were able to get NSF funding to support housing for students from 3 different universities in Madrid. All right. So just a little history about how I got involved in policy kinds of stuff. In 2013-14, I had a Jefferson Fellowship at the State Department. So I worked there, a whole other stories of what I did. I was a senior science advisor working on environmental issues in the Asia Pacific region. So I met people in the State Department. I saw kind of how things work. I saw how climate negotiations were going on within tech. Is this one plugged in too?
That one's not doing it.
It's only this one that blinks. I don't know.
Want me to put this one up?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Let's try this
The
one.
input, computer input.
Okay.
Just down to the.
No, perfect. Thank you, Faith. Okay. All right, so I kind of got a view of how things happen. When I came back here, through a contact at the State Department, I got involved with the 6th Global Environmental Outlook. So this was a run through UNEA, which I'll say a word about later. This is a United States government call for scientific experts to participate in the process of generating this report, which came out last March. It's an international report written by a bunch of experts around the world. And I was on the scientific advisory panel and became co-chair of the scientific advisory panel, which kind of oversaw the scientific integrity of it and the authorship and the outline of it and interactions with governments and a variety of activities. Then through that process, so a lot of networking here, even though I don't feel like I'm a top networker, I got involved with people who had been taking students and delegations to the UN climate conferences. So a couple of years ago, I started the process of applying for observer status to the conference, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that is, please let me stop there because I'm going to say a bit more about that. So we got approved in August. I suddenly said, oh, we can go to Santiago in December. Who wants to go? A lot of people wanted to go. I started looking for money. It got moved to Madrid at the last minute because of disruption in Chile. And we went to Madrid in November, December this year, or last year. And so in the future, we could also go to the next COP meeting or to other international policy meetings. All right, so what is the COP? And who makes international climate policy? So the UNFCCC is the treaty that all countries of the United Nations have agreed to stop dangerous climate change. It has lots and lots of moving parts and some that aren't moving as fast. Lots and lots of moving parts. The COP is the Conference of the Parties. It's the supreme decision-making body of the convention. So the convention says, we want to do this. This body says, how are we going to do it? Who's involved? How does it work? And it has a huge organizational chart, but here's sort of extract of the key parts. There's a secretariat, that's the place that's the administrative arm that kind of keeps things running. There's 400 and some people. There's a body for implementation, there's a scientific body, and the scientific body is connected to the IPCC, which generates the scientific reports. Okay, so the scientific reports are independent of the process. They're independent of governments, actually. They feed into the process, in particular at the scientific level. So COP serves as the meeting of the parties for the Kyoto Agreement and the Paris Agreement. And they have their own sets of initials, so both of those things meet there, as well as the subsidiary bodies and other subsidiary bodies. Please jump in with questions. Okay, but there are several other moving parts on the international landscape. In particular, people in the US have not paid as much attention to the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals were approved by the United Nations, by the General Assembly, a few months before the Paris Agreement on Climate was agreed. There are 17 goals, and one could argue that every piece of scholarship and research at Tech somehow connects to one of these. In fact, climate probably connects to all of them. Climate action is one of the goals. There's an entire growing literature on all these things, and most people can see themselves or their organizations as connected to at least one of those, if not many more. And climate action certainly is connected to all of them, I would say. Another piece in the landscape is UNEA. Again, this has been a bit under the radar, but I connected to it through the work on the GEO project, and I attended two of the 4 meetings of the UN Environmental Assembly. The UN Environmental Assembly was formed just a few years ago, and it is to take care of the environmental aspects of United Nations activities. It used to be United Nations Environmental Programs, UNEP, which is still involved. They're still an entity, too many entities to try to disrupt here. But basically, environmental programs were put into a box and said, okay, this group is going to deal with environmental problems. The Environmental Assembly said, wait a minute, environmental issues are everybody's problem. So now all members of the United Nations are automatically members of the UN Environmental Assembly. So just like the General Assembly that meets in New York, the Environmental Assembly meets in Nairobi. It's met 4 times so far. It's trying to get on the schedule of meeting every 2 years. So, and it, of course, environmental issues overlap with climate. They also overlap with most of the SDGs in one way or another. Okay, so this is.
Does their work feed into one of the groups you were mentioning?
They interweave,
Back and forth.
let's say. It's a little bit, there's so many small parts of, or agencies and entities within the United Nations family and sort of hanger-on, let's say, nonprofits and other entities or intergovernmental agencies. It's really hard to say which feeds to which, but they're definitely closely aligned. So you might say they're environmental issues. This one, and one of the programs for this environmental assembly fourth was a lot about plastic, which is kind of peripherally connected to climate. But it's not.
So do they issue reports or do they issue guidelines?
So they issue guidelines, so this one, much of the way this international policy works is that they work by consensus. Everybody has to agree. And so a consensus agreement might be plastic in the oceans is a bad thing, we need to do something about it. And then they might empower funding, which comes from the member states, to some entity to make some reports. They might ask UNEP to make a report. They might ask other agencies that have, or other entities within the UN that contribute to this to participate. And they might get agreements from countries saying, well, we agree to make these progresses on waste management. So it's a very fuzzy process because international law, for the most part, it's not criminal law. They can't make a law and make everybody follow it. It has to work by consensus, and all the implementation goes on at the country level. All right, so it's a complicated landscape. All these things work together to try to move things forward, but are unable to lay down laws. Okay, so here's some practicalities about attending the Conference of the Parties. So the negotiators are the parties, Conference of the Parties. They're the ones, the countries, all the countries of the United Nations. They send delegations. Sometimes there are a lot of people in a delegation. Usually from the US, there would be people from the State Department would usually lead this delegation. And then they might have people from NOAA, from EPA, from the Department of Energy, from Health and Human Services. There might be people from all over the country that have some role to play. Some countries have very small delegations because they have small governments. Some small countries actually have been allowing, especially students, youth, to participate in their delegations. In particular, Karuna, who is not here but did come to Madrid with us, has worked with the Seychelles, and you talked with the Seychelles. Still talking with the Seychelles about inviting people to come on their delegations and participate as part of the government delegations. So about 75% of the people at the meeting are negotiators. They're the ones who are making the decisions. Mostly there. So then there are observers, and the observers are primarily NGOs, non-government organizations, or IGOs, intergovernment organizations. And there's about 2,000 of them who have observer status. You have to prove various things to get observer status. You have to prove that your organization is nonprofit, that it does something related to this mandate, and a few other, a bunch of hoops to jump through. So each observer organization is issued a set fixed number of badges. Notice, everybody is wearing a badge. Even Greta was wearing a badge. Everybody has a badge. And Michigan Tech was issued 10 badges for COP25. That's it. You can't get more. You can split them over 2 weeks. So we spent basically 5-week one, 4-week 2, and then we traded one to another university. So there's some horse trading. You can exchange them around. And how many you get each time depends on the UN, the venue, how many people are applying to go, and various things that you don't know about until kind of the last minute. But as long as we keep using them, we'll keep getting some. Okay. It is possible to swap out for daily badges. It's kind of a mess. So it's kind of the opposite of conferences, academic conferences that you're used to going to, where you pay a lot, you get a badge. Here you pay nothing, but you don't get a badge unless you're on the list. Okay, so there's no cost to attend these meetings. All right, so with these 2,000 observer organizations, there's a breakdown, they're called them constituencies. And these are sort of, they're official in the UNFCCC system. We, as a university, are automatically tagged into the RINGO, Research and Independent NGOs classification, which is, the biggest ones on this list are ENGO, Environmental NGOs, and RINGO, Research and Independent. But also you can see business, farmers is a relatively recent one, indigenous peoples, local municipal authorities, governments, authorities, YONGO, and women and gender's been around for a long time. So these are, big group. They try to digest information about the conference for their constituents, but at the meeting itself, you can go to meetings from any of these things. Right. Do you guys go to any others besides the Ringo one?
Maybe one Yongo and one meeting of business, bingo.
Yeah, business. So these are helpful because they usually have a couple of people who are trying to keep track of what's going on at the meeting. And there's a lot of things happening at once and it's hard to keep track. The other thing about constituencies is because they're sort of official UN or UNFCCC, CCC entities, they often get they get to make it, I was gonna say they get a speaking, well, that's not quite right. They get to make statements at certain points. So they have meetings with the Secretariat, for example, and can offer some input into the process. They may have input at a plenary session. It's quite controlled and specific. And so as a member of the constituency, you have input to help write those statements. So research, Ringo is especially concerned that science is not being taken at the level that it needs to be taken. Yungo might say what the youth are thinking about climate and how global demonstrations are feeding into the process. The one that I saw, I saw the trade unions make a statement because Chile, even though it was not in Chile, Chile was still the official host. The Chilean Secretary of Environment was leading the system. So when Tungo got a chance to speak at one of these sessions, they complained about the treatment of people and the demonstrations in Santiago and said that feeds into the climate problem, they can't ignore it. So it's a place to make statements. Okay, so this is a slide actually stolen from Ringo. They have a guideline to the COPS slideshow. So observers, so here are the various events that go on at COP. This is where the actual negotiations are happening. Parties are in there, they're trying to make decisions where they can come out with the Paris Agreement. Not quite this time, but that's where that's happening. They have big sessions, they have small sessions, they have informal sessions, they have sessions of all those different bodies. In the meantime, in the same area that you need a badge to get into, there are side events. There are country offices and pavilions, I'll show you a picture of those. There are exhibits and there are media press events. And observers can observe most of this. Sometimes it's closed, but you can observe that. You all go and see what's going on in there. It takes practice to figure out how to follow that. Your NGO guide, constituency guide can help you figure out what's going on there. But side events are places where these NGOs, observer organizations, can put out their views, opinions, research, experience, any kind of a statement. Usually they're kind of panel discussion format. Media, press, anybody can talk to the press, and if it's interesting, the press shows up. Well, they show up, they record everything. Okay, so everything's online, you can go and see all these press conferences, including some that were done by our Michigan Tech and CSU students. The exhibits are kind of like booths where you can promote your agenda. We did a bit of that. The pavilions are run by countries or big NGOs or big entities, and they also can run the equivalent of side events. They're more informal side events. So like the IPCC had a booth and they were promoting science. The Nordic countries had a booth and they had the representatives from IKEA speaking. The international development banks had pavilions, and they were talking about the financial aspects of climate issues. There's also an off-site event kind of next to it for the public. You don't need a badge to get in there, and they're more geared towards the local population. Okay, so what we did, what the students did. This is we did way more than I can summarize in a couple of slides here. But in conjunction primarily with Colorado State University, but also Clark, and ultimately Monash University, University of Connecticut.
Scripps.
And Scripps, yeah, a couple of people from Scripps. These three universities joined together to do an online course during the fall, kind of introduced everybody to the COP system, and broke students into teams. Students doing goal-oriented science for SDGs. So the teams picked one of the SDGs, and we had eight, I put that on there, 8 SDG projects, and did a mixture of side events, pavilion events, and press conferences based on, this one was responsible consumption and production, so they did some local surveying around campus here, and then some research that Jessica and Will were doing in Illinois. Right? And so we had a series of those, and they were well attended. People were interested in those events. There, again, it is a very different feel and a very different goal from an academic conference. You're not, you can weigh in all the students here. You're not trying to show the latest, greatest, newest, hot thing, but you're trying to explain how your work can feed into these bigger discussions policy-wise. Is that accurate?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so here are a couple of people in the room at one of these side events. They all have better pictures. I didn't have very many pictures. I don't know, Alexis, here is, and I had to get a picture of Bruce. At the entrance to the COP going in, Bruce was our Michigan Tech alum who came along and investigated quite a bit of the business side of the. All right, this is what a pavilion looks like. This is the International Development Bank's, I think, pavilion. So you can see this warehouse-sized room with all of these pavilion-type things in it. Each one has a little space. Some of them serve coffee. German one, right? Good coffee. Cocktail hours. They're networking spaces, and they have a series of programming during the whole 2-week period where they're trying. These are information exchange places, and they're also, the goal is to influence policymakers, right? Okay, not always in as direct ways you might like.
Are the policymakers cruising around the pavilion?
They are cruising around, yes, they are definitely around, depending on how big the country's delegation is. They'll always have some people who are locked in the back, in the negotiation sessions, and some people are out looking around. Yeah,
Are there also, I guess with those policymakers, like, are there also like representatives from like, I think you alluded to like private banks that were there, but like certainly like World Bank may be represented there, or else
Yes,
people
for
that
sure.
used to work for World Bank. But what about like institutions that do like sustainable financing, like green banks and green lenders, things like that?
so yes, and even companies like Coca-Cola are sort of there. But the rule is that the observer organizations are supposed to be nonprofit organizations. So typically they're under the umbrella of bingo or the Chamber of Commerce or the Farmers Union or something like that. So they are definitely there, absolutely they're there. But they're not, there's no space here for commercial booths to set up and say, I'm selling Gidget X or finance instrument Y, even though they can kind of do that indirectly through these pavilion events or sign events. So it's a fuzzy line, but it's supposed to be sharp between nonprofit. In fact, there was a notice, I think, on the, where did I see this? It was on the UNFCCC, observer page somewhere that said they'd heard that some entities were trying to sell badges, basically, to come to COP, and they were like, no, you can't do that, no. So there was some advantage taken. So where the world stands for climate action, I don't have a lot of slides on what happened there, but I think I put a couple in. So what was the US doing at COP? So the United States has said they are pulling out of the Paris Agreement. They made that declaration in November. It takes effect one day after the election this year. Okay. They can go back, once they pull out, they can go back in. It's a very easy step to go back in. But at this point, they're saying they're pulling out. Okay, they're pulling out of the Paris Agreement. That does not mean they're pulling out of the UNFCCC treaty. It's a much more complicated process to pull out of a treaty. The Paris Agreement is, depending on a lot of interpretations, is under the umbrella of the UNFCCC. So they pull out of that agreement. They never joined the Kyoto Agreement while still staying in the main treaty. So they still have a place at these meetings, but they certainly have a place even at the Paris Agreement meetings that were happening here because they're still in the COP. Several countries complained about that they have a place now. And they complained about the US sitting in on and making comments during the Kyoto Protocol meetings, which are also going on because we're not a member of that. Okay, so under the official activities, one of the things that you can find on the on-demand streaming video, everything is archived here, is you can find the national statement. So every country that wants to can make a 3-minute national statement. And those are kind of cool to look at because you see what priorities the entire country wants to put in 3 minutes about climate. And so they say lots of interesting things about we don't want our country to go underwater, we are increasing our ambitions for cutting emissions, we are doing this, we are doing that. They talk about outcomes they hope for. So this poor woman from the Bureau of Oceans and International Environment, the State Department had to get up and say blah, blah, blah. The US is doing lots of science about climate and clean coal is great and a few other things that did not go over very well. But she was the official delegation, so that was her job to say that. Okay, in unofficial delegations, so not allowed to be part of the negotiating parties, there were other signs of the US being here. One was on the first day, this is really fuzzy because I tried to get off a video. On the very first day, a US congressional delegation came in and gave a press conference. So it was Nancy Pelosi, Sheldon Whitehouse, what's her name, Bernice Johnson from Texas, who's a spectacular, there are like a dozen people. And they wouldn't let us in the room, very annoying. So, but they gave a press conference basically saying, we're still in. Okay, the US Congress, even though official administration position is pulling out, we are still in and we're making efforts to cut emissions. Also in the pavilions, there was a US Action Center, and we are still in the pavilion, which had a whole series of events for over 2 weeks. This one I saw, he spoke a couple times actually. This was the Lieutenant Governor from Wisconsin, Mandela Barnes, who was very powerful. So these were cities, states, universities, businesses, lots of entities saying we are still in despite the US official delegation saying otherwise. So there's tension there. Other stuff that's going on. Greta was there. There was a mob. They do have space for kind of activist activities or demonstrations. They're very strictly controlled within the venue. There were demonstrations out in the streets. There was a big march on the Friday of the meeting in Madrid. They say 500,000 people. But within the venue, there are some scheduled activist demonstrations, right? So there were indigenous youth, there was Greta. Actually, she spoke in the plenary. She spoke to the whole conference. Who are these guys? The Climate Action Network had a little fossil of the day event where they gave a prize to whichever country was being most obstreperous. So US, Brazil, Australia, all got fossils of the day. So there's some lighthearted stuff going on, some theatrics, some music, some other things in these outer venues. All right, and a couple of people have asked me about the participation of indigenous communities in the COPs and in the negotiations. And this is actually quite interesting developing process right now. So first of all, the UN overall has a small space which people say was put in there by Eleanor Roosevelt for stakeholder engagement. It's very small. The UNFCCC made that wider for the climate negotiations and made this official observer status case where their observers can have input. The indigenous communities have been pushing since the start of COP and since discussions of the SDGs to have a stronger voice because they don't feel that they're represented by their country delegations. And that was actually agreed to in COP21, and like everything in this situation, it moves like molasses. It's incredibly slow. Everything has to be by consensus. Slow. But there is now this indigenous, local communities and indigenous peoples platforms. I don't know how to say that. I don't know if anybody tries to pronounce that. Which is got representatives from countries, but representatives equally balanced by representatives from indigenous people on each continent. And they have been working on their facilitative work group, further operationalize the platform, which this all just sounds like mumbo jumbo to scientists, but it means figuring out how they're going to get engaged in the process and working towards it. So that process is moving forward, but it's fairly new for for them to be able to, for this kind of group to have a say equal with parties. So I don't think it's gonna be equal with parties, but it will be able to have input with the parties. And so that's under discussion.
Is it analogous to, you had the women in general gender group on another slide?
Yeah, no, this is different because there's also the constituencies are about grouping the observer organizations, and there's also an indigenous group there that groups indigenous observers. This, and I was confusing them for a while, but this is more powerful than an observer organization because they're gonna have a seat at some tables. Not sure exactly which ones, but they're gonna have a more powerful voice. So, and it was great, actually, if you look at old pictures of activities at the UN, you'll see everybody is wearing a suit and tie, and they're mostly guys, right? Now, at these meetings, you see people dressed in their formal dress for wherever they're from. So you see lots of African dress, you see lots of indigenous dress, you see Indonesians and people wearing cool stuff. So it's way nicer than seeing a bunch of black suits and ties. All right, more jumping around a little bit. So outcomes from COP25. Hard to summarize in a slide or two. I think I just have one. So first of all, it's hard to summarize because there wasn't one clear, simple goal like pass the Paris Agreement. There were lots of small goals. In particular, the Paris Agreement actually becomes fully implemented in 2020, this year. And so they've been working since COP21 at making the rule book. So it's all great, we have this big goal that we're going to have a sort of a mechanism for countries to decrease their emissions and cooperate to do this. But what exactly are the rules? Who's gonna, how is it gonna be counted? And these have been worked on over the years, and now what's left is the really, really, really hard problems that they haven't been able to agree on for the past 5 years. In particular, Rule 6, a lot of talk about Rule 6. Rule 6 is about market and non-market mechanisms. And it's basically about carbon markets and carbon trading. So it has to do with if I have some emissions that I can't reduce here, but I'm gonna instead pay you to plant some trees in your country. How do I count that? Okay, first of all, it can't be double counted because I can't count that as a reduction because I'm paying you and then you also do it, count the trees planting. Okay, so that's one issue, but there's a bunch of embedded things in that kind of counting, including how things from Kyoto transfer over. And the sticklers on those agreements are Australia, Brazil, the US, sticking on different points of that. So what happened is at the end of this meeting, they invoked Rule 16, bigger than Rule 6, right? Rule 16 says, if you can't agree, if you can't come to consensus, you push it down the road and it automatically gets on the agenda for the next meeting. Okay. So that's what happened to Rule 6. But that doesn't mean that nothing happens in the interim. It means that there's a bunch of working groups trying to wrestle out these differences. And in particular, a group led by Costa Rica at the last minute came out with a list of sort of must-haves in those agreements saying, we will not agree, and they got a bunch of countries to sign on saying that whatever comes out of this Rule 6, it has to have these components. No double counting, transparency, and a variety of other things. Other issues were, there was a push for increased ambition, transparency. Increased ambition is that countries have made initial promises for cutting emissions over time, In 2020, they are supposed to revisit those, make new promises, and they are supposed to be more ambitious and better and stronger. And so there's a lot of talk about increased ambition, and the goal was to have that somehow enshrined in some agreed upon document, that there was a wrestling kind of at the last minute. It didn't quite get in. It kind of got in with some fuzzy words. Transparency, I didn't put human rights on there. There's a question about whether your market and non-market mechanisms should not trample on people's human rights. So a lot of countries said, and particularly indigenous voices, were very strong about the forest protection. They want human rights to be embedded in Rule 6. And other countries like Brazil said, oh, no, we're taking care of human rights. It's already written somewhere else. We don't need it in here. So there's, without actually saying we're against human rights, they just kind of play through. Loss and damage, the US is very touchy about loss and damage. That's who's gonna pay me when my city goes underwater because of carbon that your country emitted over the past century. Yeah, hard to come to agreement on that. On the other hand, there was a lot of energy at this meeting, and a lot of voices were raised that have been getting increasingly louder, and they were being paid attention to. So there was a large youth contingent. Of course, Greta has made that come up. There's large indigenous presence. There was a protest march in Madrid. But also there were some of the more mainstream players who are also very active. So business and labor were both, there were both groups were there with very strong statements on how business has to pay attention to climate and work to cut emissions even if their governments are not. Same with labor, they were touting their actions and their ambitions and their making statements. Also, the EU came out with a goal to be carbon neutral by 2050. The EU utilities are going to be carbon neutral before that. So there was a lot of positive, if not official, momentum. Get better. Stop here. Oh, last slide. Jen wanted some thoughts on how to get involved. So local and regional climate activities can feed into COPs. There was a lot of synergy there. Michigan Tech will have a delegation next year to Glasgow. We hope it won't be changed at last minute. You can connect with NGOs that are on the observer list. It's easy to search for where they are. Connect with the Ringo constituency group. A lot of these things are just run by volunteers, so they're very happy to have extra people to sign on to help do things. Some people nab on to one or more of the SDGs as part of their research or activities, and those all plug into climate action one way or the other. More sort of formally, IPCC, IPBES, this is the biodiversity thing, NEA reports all have open review processes. You can just go to their websites, you can sign on and say you want a review. They have to respond to every single comment. These are open reviews, your name is on there, your comment is on there, their response is on there. So IPCC reports get 10,000 comments. And I just got email yesterday from IPCC, from the U.S. Global Change Program, which coordinates the official U.S. response to IPCC. Too many details here. You can also write for them if you get connected to people who do it. And I just put in a plug here for IISD. They are the reporting agency that tells you what's going on with all of these organizations. All right. Thank you. Happy to take some questions. Yes?
Yeah, I just want to have a couple of additions to that.
Yes.
For Michigan Tech, in
Yeah.
terms of delegation, in the course of attending the conference, I spoke with one of the international coordinator of ISMON, that's the International Student Movement of the United Nations. That's
Yes,
David.
yes.
And then we are planning to have Michigan Tech branch of ISMON. They have like 2 branches in 2 universities where they have branches of ISMON, that's International Student of United Nations, International Student Movement of United Nations. So they also have delegations to the COP, and then that can increase
Right.
what's it called now, the number
Yes.
of delegates from Michigan
Right.
Tech apart from. So if we have like 10 for Michigan Tech, then ISMON Michigan Tech branch can also have a delegate.
Right.
And then can join. So we're working on the bylaw and then, getting some of the documents to set that up, which is something that can also be beneficial to Michigan Tech.
Thank you. Yeah, you can go with a badge from any entity that you're affiliated with or even provisionally affiliated with. Yes.
So Sarah, are you the administrator of that connection?
Yes.
Okay, that's really important.
That,
So-
that means I have password for the website that gets us the delegates.
Got it.
Yes.
So if
Yeah, I'm
anyone,
officially listed as.
okay, so that if anyone is interested in participating, they should come to you.
Yes.
And does that also apply to the international student movement that you're trying to set up, or is
Yeah.
so we?
Yeah, so
Well-
what I don't know. I was planning to do
yeah.
it through you, so to get after speaking with some of my colleagues,
Mhm.
those people that would like to join the ISMON once I get all the necessary documentation to set up the one for Michigan Tech. So I don't know how to get contact as many that would like to join. There can be like an email sent to you, and then it will be set up here and from there.
Okay.
So
But that's
it's
still in
open to
process, you're setting up.
that's in
Okay.
process to get some of the necessary documents.
Yeah, so if you're affiliated with other organizations that are on the official list to attend COP, they all get some badges. And they sometimes will take volunteers to help, run their booth or set up things or whatever, really depending on how the organization is. So, yeah, but email me if you want to be on the list. I have a list of people who didn't go this year who want to go next year. And I've probably this year was a mixture of people in class and out of my class, and I'm not quite sure I'm gonna manage that this year. It was complicated.
Are you teaching your seminar again?
Yes,
When?
fall.
And what's the name of that seminar and its number?
Climate, science, and policy, and it's a 54, it's UN 5400, you can look under UN course.
I had a quick
Yes,
question, Sarah. So I know you talked at the beginning, no laws are being laid down through the organization or the conference. So I guess I just wanted to ask, like, in your opinion, what do you think the most important part of these events are? Is it to, I guess, like, test these ideas once everybody's on board to really we know what we need to do? And I guess following up with that question, how many people are following along with what we've or what they've planned, especially like with the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, that's a lot of questions in one. So what's most important? I'm not sure. I think it is important to have agreements like the Paris Agreement, right? It's a treaty, even though it's not, there's no penalty for not following it. It is legally binding in an international sense, which means there's peer pressure, right? And so there's a lot of peer pressure on the international scale. So I think that's very important, but I also think that stakeholder input into that process is very important. That's what the observers are doing. And science input is very important, which is another part of what researchers are doing, because they can't make these decisions without science, really broadly based science, so social science, physical science, all aspects of how we get there. So countries have made promises through the first round of the Paris nationally determined contributions, or voluntary agreements on how they're going to get their greenhouse emissions. They have made promises that would bring the temperature by 2100 to about 3.2 degrees. And that's the reason that there needs to be increased ambition. The idea was once you figure out how to do it, it's going to be easier to do more of it.
Okay.
And so those commitments are coming through next time. So there's two aspects of that. One is what commitments are countries making, and the second one is, are they actually adhering to the commitments that they're making?
Yeah.
Okay. Some countries are, some countries not so much. And part of this rulemaking is to codify the rules about how you even count those carbon on a consistent time scale. So the first round had all kinds of comparing 1985 emissions were going to cut by 20%, or comparing to 2005, whatever. So there was a lot of it was hard to analyze those ideas to get actual more comparable status. But then the science goes into the counting processes. So hopefully it'll get better and we'll understand better how it works.
Okay, thank you.
So I know you need to be
I
somewhere.
need to be somewhere.
Yes.
Now.
So thank you very much.